How's that? I want us to do, if you'll turn to someone close to you and answer these two questions, and then I've got a couple of guys with mics ready to go. And so the questions, as you can see, what do you know about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? And then, don't open up your Bibles if you got a study Bible and you're going to open it up and start reading. And that little introductory part, that's cheating. So that's not allowed. And then, what are you hoping to gain during this quarter, during our time together? So take 2 or 3 minutes, turn to a neighbor or someone next to you, and answer those questions. That means you got to talk to each other and pretend like you like each other. And so if you're sitting next to your spouse, really make sure you play that up.
I'd like to know more about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
Okay. We'll wait just another minute, let you all talk, and then we'll get responses. All right. The first questions, what do you know about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? Someone said nothing.
It was written by Paul.
It was written by Paul to the Thessalonians or the Thessalonians. It wasn't written just by Paul, though, and we're going to get into that here in a second.
Is the 1st and 2nd letter written by Paul that is recorded in the Bible?
Yes. That's part of our discussion this morning. 1st and 2nd letter that was probably written by Paul, but one of his first letters that he wrote. What else?
The resurrection already happened.
Okay, the resurrection already happened. Okay, now let's jump to the second question. What are you hoping to learn over the next quarter regarding 1st and 2nd Thessalonians? Carolyn already answered, and she said, I just want to know more about 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So you can't say that one again. You got to be original and come up with your own answer. You can't say ditto. Okay, more background in terms of what was going on at the time. And that's kind of my wheelhouse. I say that's my wheelhouse like I'm a professional here, or an expert, I should say. I enjoy digging in and understanding what is happening at that time. Culturally, in terms of, we're going to be talking about Thessalonica and things like that. And so that helps me understand the text better. And I think it helps us as students of the Word to understand what's going on and why the author, in this particular case, it's going to be Paul, Silas, and Timothy, why these gentlemen are writing in the way that they're writing. And so when we can begin to understand the historical and the cultural context, that helps us understand the Word a little bit better and how we can apply it today. Okay? All right. We're going to move on, and I'm going to cue these guys up. We're going to watch a video. It's about a 7-minute long video. It's put on by the Bible Project. And if you have a good study Bible, the intro part to 1 Thessalonians, they're going to cover all of this and then some. The Bible Project, if you go to their website, you can look up all their videos and like intro videos to each book of the Bible, and it's really solid stuff. And so let's watch that. But for my runners, and this will probably be the last thing that we do after the video. So while you're watching it, I'm going to ask these two questions after the video. So you got to be ready with an answer. Okay? And the questions are: what is something that you learned in this video that you didn't know before? Okay? And then there may be things that you knew, but the way they describe it and explain it in the video, you're going to be like, oh, That makes a whole lot of sense. So what's something that stood out? Okay, so something you didn't know and something that stood out. So let's see if this will advance and play.
Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. This is most likely the earliest letter that we have from Paul, and the backstory for it is found in the book of Acts. It's where Paul and his co-worker Silas went to the ancient Greek city of Thessalonica. And after just 1 month of telling people the good news about Jesus, a large number of Jewish and Greek people gave their allegiance to Jesus, and they formed the first church community there. But trouble was brewing. Paul's announcement of the risen Jesus as the true Lord of the world, it led to suspicion. So the Christians in Thessalonica were eventually accused of defying Caesar, the Roman emperor, when they said that there is another king, Jesus. And this led to a persecution that got so intense, Paul and Silas actually had to flee from the city, and this was painful for them because they loved the people there so much. And so this letter is Paul's attempt to reconnect with the Christians in Thessalonica after he got a report from Timothy that they were doing more than okay. They were flourishing despite this intense persecution. He designed the letter to have two main movements. First is a celebration of their faithfulness to Jesus, and then he challenges them to keep growing as followers of Jesus. And then these two movements are surrounded by three prayers. The letter opens with a thanksgiving prayer. The two movements are linked together by a transitional prayer, and then the whole thing is concluded with a final prayer. It's a beautiful design. Paul opens by giving thanks and celebrating the Thessalonians' faith, their love for others, and their hope in Jesus despite persecution. He goes on to retell the story of their conversion, how they used to be idolatrous polytheists, and they were living in a culture where all of life was permeated by institutions and practices that honored the Greek and Roman gods. And Paul talks about how they turned away from those idols to serve the living and true God, and that they're now waiting for the coming of God's Son from heaven. So in a city like Thessalonica, transferring your allegiance to the Creator God of Israel and to King Jesus, this came at a cost. Isolation from your neighbors, hostility from your family. But for the Thessalonians, the overwhelming love of Jesus who died for them and the hope of his return, it made it all worth it. Paul then retells the story of his mission in Thessalonica and of the dear friendships he formed with the people. He uses really intimate metaphors here. They treated him like their child, and he became like their mother and like their father. He says, "We were happy to share with you not only the good news from God, but our very selves, because we came to dearly love you." Paul reminds us here that the essence of Christian leadership is not about power and having influence. It's about healthy relationships and humble, loving service. He reminds them that he never asked for money. He simply came to love and serve them in the name of Jesus. And so Paul moves on to reflect on their common persecution. Just like Jesus was rejected and killed by his own people, so now Paul is persecuted by his fellow Jews, and the Thessalonians are facing hostility from their Greek neighbors. And Paul draws a strange comfort from knowing that together their sufferings are a way of participating in the story of Jesus' own life and death. Paul then shares about the anguish he experienced when he heard of the hardships the Thessalonians had after he and Silas fled. So he sent Timothy to support them and see how they were doing. And to his joy, Timothy discovered that they were going strong. They were faithful to Jesus. They were full of love for God and their neighbors. And they longed to see Paul as much as he longed to see them. And so Paul concludes with a prayer for endurance. And what's cool is that he introduces here the topics he's going to address in the letter's second half. He prays that God will grow their capacity to love, that he'll strengthen their commitment to holiness as they fix their hope on the return of King Jesus. So he opens the letter's second movement by challenging them to a life that's consistent with the teachings of Jesus. So this means, first of all, a serious commitment to holiness and sexual purity. In contrast to the promiscuous, sexually destructive culture around them, they are to follow Jesus' teaching about experiencing the beauty and the power of sex within the haven of a committed marriage covenant relationship. God takes sexual misbehavior seriously, Paul says. It dishonors and destroys people and their dignity. Following Jesus also means a commitment to loving and serving others. So Paul instructs them that Christians should be known in the city as reliable people who work really hard, not just to make money, but so that they can have resources to provide for themselves and to generously share with people who are in need. After this, Paul addresses a number of questions the Thessalonians had raised about the future hope of Jesus' return. So some Christians in the church had recently died, most likely killed as martyrs, and their friends and family are wondering about their fate when Jesus returns. And so Paul makes it clear that despite their grief and loss, not even death can separate Christians from the love of Jesus. When he returns as king, he will call both the living and the dead to himself. And Paul uses a really cool image here. He uses language that would normally describe how a city subject to the Roman Caesar would send out a delegation to welcome or meet his arrival. Paul then applies this imagery to the arrival of King Jesus. He too will be greeted by a delegation of his people who will go to meet the Lord in the air as they welcome and escort him back to this world where he'll establish his kingdom of justice and peace. Paul then wants the Thessalonians to see how this hope should motivate faithfulness to Jesus. So he pokes fun at the famous Roman propaganda that it's Caesar who brings peace and security. Of course, Rome's peace came through violence, through enslaving their enemies, and military occupation. And Paul warns that Jesus will return as king one day and confront this kind of injustice. Followers of King Jesus should live in the present as if that future day is already here. Despite the nighttime of human evil around them, they should stay sober and awake as the light of God's kingdom dawns here on earth as it is in heaven. Paul closes all of these exhortations like he began, with a hopeful prayer, that God would permeate their lives with his holiness, that he would set them apart to be completely devoted and blameless until the return of King Jesus. 1 Thessalonians reminds us that from the very beginning, following Jesus as king has produced a truly countercultural or holy way of life. And this will sometimes generate suspicion and conflict among our neighbors. But the response of Jesus' followers to such hostility should always be love, meeting opposition with grace and generosity. And this way of life, it's motivated by hope in the coming kingdom of Jesus that has already begun in his resurrection from the dead. And so holiness, love, and future hope, that's what 1 Thessalonians is all about.
Okay, I'll get to this in a second. What's one thing that you learned and one thing that stood out to you? You don't have to answer both of them. If you just got an answer for one of those questions, that's fine. One thing that you learned and one thing that stood out. Okay, the presentation in terms of how it was organized. And the Bible Project does do it where it's organized based on the prayers. The one in chapter 1, then chapter 3, and then at the end in chapter 5. And then it talks about all the stuff in between, which is a great way to look at it. What else? Charles.
Jesus is coming back to establish his kingdom, whereas it is already established. Mm-hmm. So I consider that a false teaching, although that's a really good video.
Yeah, I caught that too, and I've watched that video several times, but the one thing I did do, in the way he's describing it, he's going back to the text and talking about what the text says. But yes, absolutely, and so when we get to that, I think it was chapter 4, verse 17, was in the video, and so we'll talk about that too. That'll be several weeks down the road. What else? Yes.
That he was teaching them to still love him and show them the right way, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though they're evil, we're still supposed to love them and teach them and honor them. Ed?
I was impressed with how fast they drew those pictures.
Those artists are good, aren't they?
Yeah, I wish I could draw that quickly, but they were almost perfectionly done.
Yeah, oh yeah, they do a good job. Okay, so one of the things that I'm showing this slide here, and I think for our runners, you can sit down now. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and ask, and I give no guarantees and I'm going to know the answer to your question. But but we'll try and work through it. And if I don't know the answer, then somebody smarter than me in here may be able to answer it. So when I was tasked with 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, there's also another resource that I was given. It's the flex material that 21st Century Christian puts out, and it was Mind the Gap, and it only covered 1st Thessalonians. And so I'd known for about a year that I was going to be teaching this, and I'd been working through this material right here, and it's from the Excel Still More Bible workshop that's put on in Oklahoma. And the guy, the third name down, Garrett Bernethy, if you can see that, he's the one that's in charge of that. And he brings people like Denny Petrillo and Joe Wells, Billy Claybaugh is another preacher down in that area. And they've put together this material. And the way they do it, it starts off with the exegesis of the chapter, digging into it. Okay, this is what it means. And then these two resources, Denny Petrillo is the one that does that. And then Joe Wells does the application part of it. Okay, now that we know what the text says, how does this apply? And then either Bernethy or Claybaugh, they come in on the back end and they talk about the fact like, okay, we know what the text says, we're applying it, but how does this build my faith? And so these are two really good resources, and I'm using these to work through 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. I'm also using these two resources. These are commentaries on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The one on the right by G.K. Beale is probably one that I'm leaning on the most and reading through it. What I like about commentaries, and we're not going to get into a lot of this stuff, we're going to get into a lot of one thing, but not a lot of the other thing. The background, the historical context, the cultural context, commentaries are really good for that stuff. The other things that commentaries do is there's nuances in Scripture, and so they'll say, well, you know, these people think it means this, and these people think it means this, and these people think it means this. Here's my opinion, and I think this is the best thing for this. And it usually centers around a word or a phrase in the original language and how it's interpreted. And we'll talk about that in a second, just to give you an example. We're not going to dive into all that stuff because we could spend a whole year or more trying to figure all that stuff out. And we're just going to deal with the text and how it's going to apply to us. I'm black and white. And so it's like, hey, this is what the text says, and this is what it means, and let's take it at face value. And you'll see an example of that here in a second, okay? I need to slow down because you're going to have like 15 minutes to just sit and stare at each other. All right, let's see if I can advance that. There we go. All right, let's get the background and the setting here. If you'll open up your Bibles, go ahead and mark 1 Thessalonians so you're there, and then jump to the book of Acts. We'll be in 1 Thessalonians flipping around a little bit. But to help us understand what's going on and how this book came about, we've got to take a look at the book of Acts. And when you start in chapter 15, that's when the Jerusalem Council takes place. And that's when some folks in Antioch are trying to figure out, like, okay, what about circumcision? Do we have to do circumcision like it says in the law of Moses, or what's the deal? And so Paul and a delegation of men are sent to Jerusalem to ask the apostles and to figure that out. Okay? And that is really the beginning of Paul's second missionary journey. So on the bottom right of your screen, you'll see Jerusalem. That's the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a map, and the lines are obviously, or I say obviously, I'm not trying to be demeaning. The lines and the arrows are the route that Paul travels in his second missionary journey. And so after they receive a letter from the apostles and the elders there in Jerusalem, they're sent on. And they go to Antioch first, which is right up here, if you can see it. They go there first. And they're trying to decide where to go and who to take. And that's when Paul and Barnabas have their dispute over John Mark. Because in the first missionary journey that Paul and Barnabas take, they're in this area right here, and John Mark decides, okay, I'm done. I'm going home. For whatever reason, the text doesn't tell us why, but John Mark leaves them, and that for some reason is still a burr under Paul's saddle, and he's still upset about that. And Barnabas is like, let's take him. He's good. He's solid. And so they have such a strong dispute that you see this dotted line right here. They go separate ways. Barnabas and John Mark go to Cyprus. Paul and Silas, they go this direction. And it's up here in Derbe and Lystra and Antioch right here where they pick up Timothy. And I'm paraphrasing here, but you can follow along as you're flipping through. They pick up Timothy there in chapter 16, and then they keep on going this way. But there's, in there, Paul is wanting to go back this direction towards Asia. He has a strong desire to go back that way, but then he has that vision or that dream and the Macedonian call and saying, hey, come here. And so you'll see up here in the top of, this is Greece right here, this is Macedonia. At present day, it's all Greece, but this is Macedonia. And so from Troas, they sail to Neapolis and get to Philippi and then end up in Thessalonica. And so when you look at that, you see also in chapter 16, there's the people in Philippi get upset with Paul and run him out. And so then they go to Thessalonica, and they're only in Thessalonica for about 4 weeks, 4 weeks or so. And the Jews there get upset with Paul, and they run him out too. And so when Paul and Silas and Timothy leave, they end up in Berea. And that's where you see in the text there, what chapter is that, 17? 17 verse 10. But they end up in Berea, and they're preaching and doing all the things there. And that's where we see the Bereans were of such noble character that they are digging into the Scriptures daily to make sure that what Paul is teaching is correct. Well, guess what? There's some Jews there that get jealous. And not only that, the Jews from Thessalonica, they hear like, hey, Paul is in Berea doing the same stuff there that he was doing here. And so they go over to Berea, and they cause a disturbance, and they run Paul off. And so Paul has to go, not that he has to, but he goes all the way down here to Athens. Now, from Philippi to Thessalonica, I'm going to show another map here in a second. Anybody know how far apart that is? If someone goes like this, I may throw this clicker at you. Close. 70 miles. Close, sir. It's 90 miles. So from Philippi to Thessalonica, it's about 90 miles, and then from Thessalonica to Berea, I should have looked that up, it's a lot shorter. So if you think about Philippi to Thessalonica, that's like from here to where? Bliss? Is that about 90 miles? Just outside of Twin Falls? If I'm going the other way, is Ontario 90 miles away? Or is that 75? Midvale. Go to Midvale. Okay? That's about 90 miles away. I was teaching through this with the teens, and I asked them, I was like, hey, who wants to go for a walk to Bliss? And they're like, no, you can go by yourself. So I'll drive. Okay, so that's Paul's missionary journey. Let's talk about the authors. Okay, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. When you flip back, you can keep I don't think you need to keep a finger in Acts, but you can if you want to. When you look at 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, chapter 1, verse 1 of each book, it says, Paul, ESV, New American Standard, will say Silvanus. That's another rendering of Silas and Timothy, okay? So here's where, like commentaries, I mentioned this earlier, where they'll give several different theories and then say, this is probably the most plausible one, or this is the theory that has the most evidence to support it. And so let's go with this one. And so oftentimes what people will do, they'll say, well, I don't know that Paul and Silas and Timothy are the authors of that. I know their name is affixed to it, but we're not certain that it's them. And in this case, when it comes to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, they're saying that because the style of writing in 1 Thessalonians is different than the style of writing in 2 Thessalonians. And what I mean by style, it really comes down to the different things that are being addressed in 1 Thessalonians as opposed to 2 Thessalonians. So some people are saying, well, Paul may have wrote 1 Thessalonians, but he didn't write 2 Thessalonians because just the style is different. And so he couldn't have written it. So commentators will give the different theories and say this is probably the most probable one. It is historically accepted that Paul, Silas, and Timothy are the authors of both letters. And I came across this and I was trying to find who said it, and I thought it was so good, and I wanted to quote it, but anyways, I think it was Denny Petrillo in one of these Excel Still More booklets. When it comes to these different theories and things like that, the burden of proof is placed on the person putting forth the theory. So if I were to come along and say, well, I don't think Paul and Silas and Timothy wrote 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I think it was somebody else. Even though the text says it's Paul, Silas, and Timothy. So the burden of proof is not on you to disprove my theory. The burden of proof is on me to prove that my theory is correct. Okay? And so when I came across that, I thought, man, that is so good. Because for me, sometimes it's like, well, how do I refute some of these things that come out, and especially when you're trying to dig into a text and things like that, and you come across weird stuff. Well, how do I refute that? And some stuff we should refute and say, no, that's not right. That is not correct, and we need to talk about that some more. Others, it's like, hey, that is so far out there. You go ahead and prove that, buddy, because I don't think you're going to be able to. Because the burden of proof is on you, not me. Does that make sense? And so that's important to remember. Although I do want to say, when it comes to if you have a good quality commentary, it's good to know what the different theories are, especially if they're major things that they're talking about. If it gets into the minutia of things, it's like, let's just keep moving. And that's what commentaries do a lot of. They delve into the minutia of things, and we're not going to do that for this class. Okay, so the authors are Paul, Silas, and Timothy. We all know who Paul is. Silas was in the church there in Jerusalem, and he goes with Paul starting on that second missionary journey from Jerusalem. Timothy is picked up there around Lystra and Derbe and Antioch there in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. Okay, this letter, as was pointed out, was written around 50 A.D., probably one of the first letters that Paul writes. And just so you know, I'm covering 1 Thessalonians right now. Towards the end of February, we'll do the same thing with 2 Thessalonians, although we won't spend as much time in the background and setting, because a lot of what we're talking about now is also going to apply to 2 Thessalonians. Okay, so written around AD 50. Okay? Maybe I'll advance. Class is over. Okay, the place of writing. Where did Paul write 1 Thessalonians? And I put on there between Athens and Corinth. Most likely it's in Corinth. And so what happens is the first 3 chapters, when you read through 1 Thessalonians, the first 3 chapters is Paul and Silas and Timothy writing about how excited they are of the faith of the Thessalonians. And about how good they are doing. And they are proud of the Thessalonian church. But in there we see that they wanted to go back to Thessalonica over and over and over again. I say over and over and over again. They tried to go back at least 2 times, probably more than that. But they were prevented for whatever reason. The text doesn't tell us why they were prevented. And so Paul is so distraught over this that he eventually just sends Timothy. Timothy, go back to Thessalonica. And we see that there in the end of chapter 2, first part of chapter 3. And so he goes back and brings back a report. And when Timothy finally meets back up with Paul and Silas, they most likely are in Corinth at this time. And so the letter is written from Corinth and then sent back. And it's probably, so the other thing is too, to consider here. This is the kind of the historical context. Paul only spends roughly 4 weeks or so with the Thessalonians, 3-4 weeks. And we may think, man, that's a long time. You know, if you go and visit family for 4 weeks, it's like, whew, it's time to go back home. Or if you go on vacation for 4 weeks, it's like, I'm ready to go back home. That time period, it's probably not as long or it felt as long. The other thing is, so from when they leave Thessalonica and they end up in Corinth and write this letter, it's probably 12 to maybe 18 months. That's the time frame. So they haven't been gone from Thessalonica for very long before Paul sends back this letter. And so to me, that struck me as I was reading through this and preparing for all of this. I thought, oh, wow, wait a second. You know, when I read through the New Testament, I read these letters and I think of Paul's missionary journeys. I always got in the mindset of like, oh, it's like 5 or 10 years later that Paul writes his letters. And that's not the case. And especially here, it's not the case. And so when Timothy is sent back, they're almost in Athens or are in Athens. Timothy's sent back. That may have only been about 6 months, 4 to 6 months, and before he's sent back. And then when the letter is finally sent, it's 12 to 18 months later. That gives you a time frame. And so for us, modern day times, you know, we've shortened those things, and it's, you know, you might think, well, 4 to 6 months, that might be in our time, you know, a month or two. And then 12 to 18 months, that might feel like 6 or 7 months. Does that make sense what I'm saying on that? And that's a cultural difference, and also because of modern times, you know, we have our travel's way different, our communication is way different than what it was in the first century. Okay, I digress. When does class get out? 10? I heard 10. Okay. I better start picking up the pace. Who are the recipients? You see in 1 Thessalonians verse 1, to the church of the Thessalonians in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. When you look at Acts chapter 17 verses 1 through 9, you see that it's Jews, God-fearing Gentiles, prominent women, and city leaders. And the one city leader that's mentioned in Acts chapter 17 is Jason. So that makes up the church in Thessalonica. All right. The purpose for writing. Why does Paul write? Now, this is not an exhaustive list as to what I'm going to put up here, because I'm working through this morning and reviewing everything. I was like, oh, I forgot this one. So this is not an exhaustive list. So the first one is he's writing because he attempted to visit, but he couldn't. We see that in chapter 2. We can read that. Chapter 2, verse 17. But since we were torn away from you, and that's language to say, hey, we were run out of town. But Paul writes it much more eloquently. But since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart, we endeavored the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face, because we wanted to come to you. I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us. Okay? And so he's writing back to, because he wanted to visit, but he couldn't. He also wanted to remind them. Remember, and I'll touch on this over and over and over again, the first 3 chapters is Paul and Silas and Timothy talking about how well the Thessalonians are doing and how proud they are of them. And then they get into chapter 4 and 5, and that's where there's a challenge to say, hey, you're doing these things and you're doing them well, keep doing them, but also remember these things as well. Okay, and that's how the book is kind of divided. It's divided not in half, but the first 3 chapters and then the last 2. So he's writing to remind them, and you'll see this, chapter 4, to maintain their purity. If you remember the video, it's Thessalonica is a Roman city, and it's based on the Roman gods and the Greek gods, and there's a lot of things that are contrary, is that the right word? Opposite to what it means to maintain purity, okay? He's also writing to, remind them about proper conduct towards outsiders. Just because we're Christians, it doesn't mean that we get in our little enclave here and we only worry about ourselves. We are also to interact with those on the outside, and let's make sure our conduct towards them is in a manner worthy and pleasing to God. And then the last thing here is respect for their leaders. Now, again, this is not exhaustive, because one of the main things that I think 1 Thessalonians is all about is that the church was established here in Paul's second missionary journey, and he established it in 3 or 4 weeks, and then he had to leave. And it's a congregation that's made up of very young Christians. But when he finds out from Timothy's report there in chapter 3, he's super excited about how well the Thessalonians are doing, how they are growing in their faith. And so he's also writing to encourage them, hey, keep doing the things that you're doing. And in fact, keep adding to that. And so there's a theme here, or a purpose here to encourage the church in Thessalonica as much as he possibly can. 9:40, is that what I heard? Oh, good, oh man, buckle up, folks. Okay, here we go. There we go. Okay, let's talk about Thessalonica for a second. Thessalonica was founded around 315 BC by Cassander, king of Macedonia. Now, wives, don't be jealous here, okay? Don't get upset at your men, because Cassander, the king of Macedonia, named Thessalonica for his wife Thessalonica. So if there's not a city named after you, wives, don't be upset at your husbands, okay? All right, so the next thing is, let me go here. It's the best natural harbor on the Aegean Sea at the Gulf of Thermi. Anybody been there? I haven't, so we got maps. All right, so when you look at this, hopefully you can see this. This is Asia Minor. Troas is somewhere up here, sails to Neapolis, which is right here so, goes to Philippi, and then over here to Thessalonica, runs off to Berea, and then down here to Athens and Corinth, okay? And so this is the Aegean Sea, and then this is the Gulf, and I've got a close-up of that so you can see it better. So it's the best natural Gulf on the Aegean Sea. And so what you'll see here, too, they sail into Neapolis, go to Philippi, they come through these towns, is what it tells us in Acts, ends up in Thessalonica. When they run out of Thessalonica, they go over here to Berea, which isn't as far away as it is from Philippi to Thessalonica. But this does make a natural harbor, and is one of the best natural harbors there on the Aegean Sea. And so that's Thessalonica, and that's where it's set. But it's also one of those things when you're looking at it too, and you consider the book of Acts and the way the gospel spread. This is a major thoroughfare, not just by land, but also by sea. And so that's important, or at least I think it's important for me to recognize that, and also to say, like, wow, the gospel really did spread at a really good time, because the road systems were really good, the sea routes were really good, and so it was easy for the gospel to spread out. Okay? Keep that in your memory. And there we go. All right, let's talk about themes and key words. When I talk about key words, it's also a theme, at least in my mind. And so what I mean by key word or key words, it's a word that's used over and over and over again in the book of 1 Thessalonians. And there's a reason for that, especially, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, okay? So the first one, a key word is God. It's also a theme. It's used or occurs in 1 Thessalonians 37 times. And you may be thinking, well, why is that important to know? Oh, I got 5 minutes. It's used 37 times, but it's also a theme for this reason. It's a relatively young church with a lot of young Christians. And when we start to go through the text, you're going to see, along with this word, and also with Jesus, which occurs 16 times, and Lord, which was referring to Jesus, is used 24 times. It's to remind the young Christians who is number one, and that's God. But it's also, Paul uses that as a technique to also remind them of who Jesus is. He is Lord. He is the gospel. And He is the good news, and that's why we are Christians. And so even though these are key words, it's also a prominent theme that runs through the letter of 1 Thessalonians, okay? And then it also builds on that, because here's some other key words. Word, which is referring to the gospel, occurs 14 times. Faith occurs 14 times. And then also gospel occurs 7 times. And so this is the repetitiveness is to remind these young Christians of who they are. As Christians, they're Christians because of who God is and who His Son is, but they're also Christians because of the gospel, the good news. And so they're to continue to build their faith. Okay? All right, a theme verse. And kind of what I'm landing on in terms of, I'm going to wrap up in perfect time. In terms of what I think our quarter is going to be focusing on for the next 3 months, next quarter. So 1 Thessalonians chapter 10, this is the New American Standard. For indeed you do practice it toward all the brethren who are in all Macedonia, but we urge you, brethren, to excel still more. Now, this is at the end of that section when Paul is talking about purity with regards to their sexuality, but he's also in there, and you can go back in the chapter 3, he's talking about all these things that the Thessalonians are doing really, really well in. And he's telling them, hey, you're doing awesome in these things. Keep doing those. Excel still more in those, because when you do, you are going to continue to grow in your faith. ESV isn't as clunky as the New American Standard. And that's going to read like this, if it'll pop up. Here we go. Maybe? There it is. For that indeed is what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more. So, for me, for this quarter, this is where I'm going to come back to a lot. And so even though there are folks in here that may have been Christians for a very, very long time, some folks may be Christians for a short amount of time, but it doesn't matter how long we've been a Christian. There are things that we are going to find in this text that Paul was encouraging the church in Thessalonica to do, but it applies to us as well. And these are things that we should be doing as Christians, present day, here at Linder Road, at the Linder Road Church of Christ. But in that, we are to excel still more in those things. We are to do those things more and more. Well, why? Well, the reason why is because we want to continue to grow in our faith and become more like God's Son, Jesus Christ, every day. And so there's this idea when Paul says this, do this more and more, that is going to happen. But if we stop, well, nothing is going to happen. We're not going to continue to grow. We're not going to continue to build up our faith and to become more like God's Son, which is what we should be striving to do every day. Any questions? You got 10 seconds.
I was just going to say, in that video, it showed that there was tribulations along the road, but they kept going and worked through them. And that's true of us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Things are going to get tough. And this is something I tell the teens all the time. And I know if you have questions, write them down and we can save them for next week. Next week, we're going to dig in. We're going to jump into chapter 1 and work through chapter 1. we have it so good. We have it so good here in the good old U.S. of A. We don't know what persecution's like. We don't understand persecution. We don't know what it means to be run out of our homes or to run out of the communities that we live in and serve in. We don't know what it's like to be stoned, to have rocks thrown at us. I think there are people in this world that do understand that, but here in the U.S., we don't get that. And so when we read through some of these things, and Paul is going to talk about this in the second chapter of Thessalonians, we read this, and holy cow, Paul is a stud. I mean, you want to talk about a man who's a man, Paul is that guy. And he's the one that is so encouraging. He's like, listen, look at what happened to me, but learn from that and know that there are better things that we are looking forward to than what may be happening to us right now. All right, I better end because people are wanting to come in. Thank you.